Stewart. Thank you, Robert, for your help. Thank you also to the Japanese traditional music performers. And thank you to Kay Redfield Jameson, the author of An Unquiet Mind. There's several upcoming events I'd like to bring to your attention. Tomorrow at 4 p.m. in the Architecture Building, room 100, Dennis Ebbets of the Ball Corporation Aerospace Systems Division will talk about NASA's Hubble Space Telescope. That's tomorrow at 4 p.m. In the Architecture Building right next door in room 100. And tomorrow night at 8 p.m., the keynote address here in Tent 1 will be given by Robert Pinsky, the U.S. Poet Laureate. It's tomorrow night, 8 p.m., in this tent, the keynote address by the U.S. Poet Laureate Robert Pinsky. I'd personally like to thank Beth Turcott, Kathy Hartwick, and their assistant Sarah Hughes for the good work that they've put in, especially Beth and Kathy, over the last year. Thank you very much. Also, I'd like to thank Kara Haven for helping out tonight with the slide projectors. In 1988, two faculty members from the Department of Architecture, Dr. Bruce Meyer and Professor Paul Lasso, conceived and implemented the first UniverCity. Paul is with us tonight in the front row. Paul, would you please stand up? Please. Thank you. Thank you, Paul. Not quite as much as Thomas Krens. I've been on the road and up in the air quite a bit this year. So I'd like to use this introduction to frame a slight travel advisory. You should go to Venice. Okay, if you've heard nothing else tonight, go to Venice. Go ride in a gondola. Hold hands with your lover. Feed the pigeons in Piazza San Marco. Go to Murano Island and buy some glass. And make sure you see the Peggy Guggenheim collection. Visit her palazzo on the Grand Canal. Tour the excellent collection of modern art. Sit in the village courtyard. Write some postcards and sip some coffee. There's no place like it in the world. Even if you've been to Venice, take my advice, go again. Go to Venice, California as well. I did last October with Kara and 23 other architecture students and 2 faculty colleagues. We went for 6 days. Try to experience, as we did, the great architecture in that city and the SoCal lifestyle. We surfed, we did some inline skating, we did some body piercing, and we did some Disney landing. We had a great time out there. You should try to visit, if you care about architecture, try to visit some of the prominent architectural offices. Some of you will recognize these names. We were able to organize tours at Morphosis, Eric Owen Moss, and Moore Rubel Udell. Do not try to visit the office of Frank O'Geary and Associates, the architecture firm that designed the quite extraordinary Guggenheim Bilbao in Spain. Geary's office does not schedule such tours. In fact, when one of our alums who works in the office took me to the architect's office on a Sunday afternoon, I was asked to leave. So my advice is, do not go to Frank Geary's office. Instead, you could and you should go to Frank Geary's home, as I did with 20 students. In our defense, this project put Frank Geary on the architectural map when it was completed, about 15 years ago. And aspiring architects should see it. Still, when a student approached me with a white fibrous mass in his hand and said it was Frank Geary lint that he had taken from the dryer exhaust vent, well, I knew that even if the student was joking, that it was time to leave, that it was time for us to leave Mr. Geary alone. Go to New York City and see the exhibition titled Project for a New Guggenheim Museum in New York City. Give yourself plenty of time. You've never seen anything quite like this exhibition or like this building. I think you'll be pulled in by the exhibit. I didn't see people walking through this room at the Guggenheim very quickly. Everyone was stopping, pausing, walking, reading, listening. They were pulled in by the models and the drawings that came out of Frank Gehry's office, by the music, the words, and the imagery put together by the Guggenheim staff. Allow yourself to be taken in by the design thinking and the design itself. Go to the Guggenheim, New York. Be seduced. Write Rudy Giuliani a letter supporting the project. That said, those things said, what do these 4 moments, a Venetian courtyard, an office eviction, Frank Gehry lint, and a new Guggenheim exhibition, what do they share? First, I'm wondering about the demands made by the tourist economy, by the entertainment dollar. Is it necessary to construct a firewall between building a museum constellation, what marketers would refer to as the brand, and the intellectual integrity of the museum? If such a wall is attempted, can we even maintain it? Second, I wonder about the control mechanisms that must be established to produce architectural works of great significance. Who is left out when only a few are let in? And who must be left out if great works are to be created? And I have questions about the relationship of great artistic and architectural works, the physical reality, to new virtual realities. What do the physical and virtual realms share? Or how can the two realities reinforce and challenge each other? Our speaker tonight is sure to help us with these questions. Thomas Krens was born in New York City in 1946. He earned a BA from Williams College, an MA from State University of New York in Albany, and a master's degree in public and private management from Yale University. He knows teaching, having taught in an art department for 20 years while at Williams College. In 1988, Mr. Krens was named director of the Solomon R. Guggenheim Foundation. He has overseen the restoration and expansion of the Solomon R. Guggenheim Museum in New York City, the creation of the Guggenheim Museum Soho in New York City, design of the Guggenheim Museum Bilbao in Spain, and establishment of the Deutsche Guggenheim Berlin in Germany. Mr. Krens serves as the director of these institutions and of the Peggy Guggenheim Collection, which is located in Venice, Italy. The title of Mr. Krens' talk this evening is The Arts and Culture in the 21st Century. Please join me in welcoming Mr. Thomas Krens.
So I can see it. Wes, I want to thank you for that introduction. I'll talk to Frank about the lint from his dryer, and I'll see that you get a box of it sent over here as soon as possible. I want to thank Wes for his kind words and for the invitation to come to speak to you all here this evening about art, culture, institutions, art museums in the 21st century. Let me say right off the bat that I'm not sure that I have anything to tell you about these complex topics that aren't filtered by my own experience, but as Wes has suggested, that experience touches on some exotic locations. So the worst that you'll get this evening is some interesting pictures of faraway places. But before I get into that, I just want to thank a few people here that have made me feel so welcome in Muncie. Wes referred to Kathy Hartwick and Beth Turcott. I also want to thank Tom and Francis Sargent, who had a dinner just before this event this evening that was delightful, and I got a chance to meet a lot of people from both the university and the community. And I want to thank the president of Ball State, Blaine Brownell, and the provost, Warren Vanderhill, for everything they've done to make me feel warm and welcome here. And now the punchline, I feel qualified to address an audience of Hoosiers because for two reasons. One, I played professional basketball for 1 year in France in 1970 for Nice. So I do know what a basketball is. And secondly, about 2 weeks ago, I went on a motorcycle ride from St. Petersburg to Novgorod, which is an ancient Russian city of the 9th century, about 150 miles south of St. Petersburg. And one of my riders was Dennis Hopper, who you all recall was Shooter in The Hoosiers, that movie in 1986, for which he won an Academy Award nomination. So I'm not exactly alien to the local culture. I want to talk, as I said before, all kidding aside, the topic is a serious one. At least it's a serious one for me, and I found myself wrapped up in this notion of educational institutions and cultural institutions over the last 12 years, and it's been somewhat of an adventure. And along the way, they didn't tell me about the train, by the way. Along the way, I learned a couple of things about how institutions evolve. As Wes pointed out, I did teach at Williams for almost 20 years. I joined the faculty in the studio department in 1971 and somehow segued into the art history department thanks to George Hurd Hamilton, who was a great art historian at Yale and came to Williams to run the Clark Art Institute. And in 1976, he invited me to teach history courses. And I began to fasten on certainly the 20th century, but probably more broadly the institutions by which we understand, learn about, and consume culture. And I sort of found myself to be a kind of critic of art museums, largely from a distance, because I found that they didn't really serve my teaching function. And I remember very specifically one time in the middle 1970s, I was teaching a studio course and I wanted to show my students Ellsworth Kelly's work, and I took them down to New York on a field trip, and I could find one painting at the Museum of Modern Art. And it became clear that there were more than one Ellsworth Kelly painting in New York City, but you could only see one. It was hard to kind of like draw any conclusions from one. And it just occurred to me that for contemporary art, perhaps museums were largely irrelevant. I won't tell you how I came to be the director of the Guggenheim, but perhaps that's not as important as some of the lessons along the way. I came to the position with a sense of the limitations of the institution. They're perhaps captured by these two statements, one by Andre Malraux, is that I used to work for 5 years on an archaeological excavation in Asia Minor, and I was always captured by the notion that when you went to a museum and looked at Greek architecture, you always saw these white columns, and it was really pristine and pure and beautiful. But the reality is, as we dug this stuff up, it was all polychrome. It was painted. And so if you could imagine a kind of a perfectly proportioned Greek temple in relatively garish colors, that was closer to the reality. And indeed, many of our own hopes and aspirations are transmitted to cultures that we don't know as a mechanism for our understanding those cultures. And I was aware of that kind of transformation, that limitation. I wasn't so sure. I didn't have an evolved position about museums, but I had questions about them. And then historically, I began to see a statement that I've often used as I've talked about this. The public art museum is an 18th century idea, which is the encyclopedia in a 19th century box, the extended palace. And we know this because before 1789, the Louvre was a private house. And that they more or less fulfill their structural destiny. In other words, what we usually expect public art museums to be is an embodiment of notions that were formed in the 19th century. And because they weren't able to show me Ellsworth Kelly in depth, I had some serious questions about whether art museums could show me anything in depth. And so therefore I found myself in this field. But I'm going to jump quickly if I can make these slides work, and let me try to get the technology down a little. I can't make the one on the right work. I don't know. Is it plugged into a remote control? That's it. Okay, right? If we wait long enough, maybe the train will go by. I probably should hold this up a little bit more too. That makes it, you can hear me a little bit in the background. Well, I tell you what we could do with the technology is that every time I turn the one on the left, if you could just press the button for, is that, okay, there we go. All right, we'll get into this. One of my early conclusions when I began to think about, and I wonder if you could turn this this main light down too, since we're, you don't need to see me quite with such brilliance. So maybe if you had the same amount of light we have over there, that'd be terrific. One of the things I also was aware of as an historian was that that things change, and if I needed to know that things changed, I could show you these two photographs. You might not know what you're looking at, but the photograph on the left is the Metropolitan Museum in 1872. Metropolitan Museum in New York City. At that time it was on 14th Street. And the photograph on the right is the Guggenheim Museum in 1937 on East 54th Street in New York City, an automobile showroom. It was called the Museum of Non-Objective Painting. Fast forward a century or so later, the Metropolitan, of course, we know it is this great classical building on Fifth Avenue, and the Guggenheim, a building designed by Frank Gehry, sort of very famous in its own context. So I got this thing that art museums didn't work and that things changed. I came to the Guggenheim in 1988. I had to come up with a strategy for the institution, and given the fact that I'd been to Yale and had their, at that time, their equivalent of an MBA, I did an analysis and I tried to get an understanding of the environment. And I did this chart that you see on the left, and it basically shows a long-term income curve for the art museum industry compared to a long-term expense curve. And without going into the analysis, but it was a statistically driven analysis. We took a look at the 30 largest art museums in the United States and concluded that between 1965 and roughly the mid to late 80s, that the income lines for these art museums were growing about 3 or 4 times the rate of inflation. And if you anticipated that those income lines were going to have to flatten over the long term because the growth was unrealistic, and we knew it was unrealistic because at that rate, by the middle of the 21st century, the entire GNP would be devoted to those 30 art museums. You knew that the income curve was going to flatten out, yet there was compelling argument that the expense curve was going to continue to climb. One, that it was a field that was driven by training and intelligence, and most museum professionals were very poorly paid. It was also a field that was being driven by market prices, and prices with general prosperity for artworks, including insurance, were getting increasingly expensive. And also it was being driven by technology. So we came to some conclusions that the expense curve was rising faster than the income curve, and that was a very dangerous situation for the field in general. And it's just important to know that, because the logic is that if you could develop a strategy for the 21st century that addressed this condition, even if you were misstated the condition, even if the condition was not as serious as was suggested, if the strategy were successful and you were successful, your institution would be stronger. But I still think that that was a reasonable representation of the condition at the time. Another thing that we knew was that art museums could not address the works of art that had been placed in their care. I mean, I used as an illustration this work of photograph of several sculptures by Richard Serra. I mean, those were actually on view at the Guggenheim Museum in Bilbao, and each of those pieces weighs about 170 tons. And I know that there is no other museum in the world that can handle those floor loads, and there is no museum in the world that can handle the storage requirements of works like that. Yet those works were not made to challenge the condition of art museums. They were made for reasons that having to do with the development of the artist's works and otherwise. The fact is that the institutions were not able to respond to the requirements of the work. And you could use other examples. They don't have to be heavy, but museums are really not prepared to collect performance art. They're not really prepared to deal with technology and what technology means, and all kinds of, or huge areas of multimedia art. So I began to see the museum as a kind of, if not exactly a failed institution, at least a challenged institution. And you could capture the crisis of art museums at the end of the 20th century with these 5 notions. There was a crisis of space, I knew that because the Guggenheim was not a particularly large museum, but we only showed at any given time about 2% of our collection, and we were only 65 years old. So what happens for the next 50 years, let's say? Where are we going to put it? How are we going to store it? How are we going to take care of it? There certainly was a crisis of funding, because part of that declining income curve is a function of the fact that it's pretty clear to me that, particularly in the United States and in other places around the world, it is generally a government policy to transfer support of culture from the public to the private sector. The NEA was founded in 1865 with an annual budget of $5 million. It grew to 180 by 1980. It's down to 140, I think, these days. And it doesn't take an MBA to calculate that, that the purchasing power of government support for culture spread out to cover a far wider clientele and audience is less important in supporting these institutions than it's ever been before. And I actually forecast a time, I can see a time where government support, both at a local and a federal level, could completely dry up, including the deduction of works of art, particularly of works of art for which donors can take a tax deduction equivalent to the market value of the work. So I see that there's a crisis of funding. I see there's a crisis of content. What do? We live in a multivalent, multicultural society. I know that when I came to the Guggenheim, about 86% of the work was contemporary art was done by European artists. Is that a representative 21st century institution when it ignores probably 80% of the population of the rest of the world and vibrant contemporary cultures elsewhere? So there is seriously a question as to what these institutions should be doing. There's a crisis of technology. Basically, these institutions are strapped for resources, and technology costs money. So how do you invest? When do you invest? And in what do you invest? And then there's a crisis of structure, is that when I said that there were 19th century institutions that had been organized around a region, you still find that model to be the dominant model these days. Support for the Detroit Institute of the Arts comes from local governments and a local community, and there's no such thing as a kind of effective networking among cultural institutions that I really know of, where they truly share resources in a meaningful way. And that whole structure of how, in fact, you create the administrations that implement cultural programming was in question. So I came to the Guggenheim as a skeptic. I saw a really big crisis in this particular field. So what do? Pragmatism says come up with a plan. Well, this was the plan. I'm not going to go through it, but basically I divided up into 7 parts. You had to look at what makes an institution great, I said. 1 is collection, 2 is its buildings and physical plant, 3 is its endowment. Big endowment's important. You can do a lot of things. 4 is operations. You want operations that are intelligent and that can break even, reach a large audience. 5, you got to have a great staff, and 6, you got to have a great program. Put those 6 things together, you've got a strong institution. The Guggenheim in late 1988 was not a strong institution, and so we needed to do all of it simultaneously, absolutely all of it. And I think in some ways that's been you might say, the saving strategy of the institution to the degree that it's been saved, but we'll see more about that later. First thing was, when you took a look at the building, I sort of said the first couple of years, the program, the collection, there was not much that we could do about that, but the Frank Lloyd Wright building, opened in 1959, by the late 1980s was really in sad shape. It was in need of major restoration. To do that, we had to build a new building, which you see here, that took some of the pressure off the Frank Lloyd Wright building. The whole thing cost about $80 million. We only had about 20. What to do? There was a problem. We did what you usually do. You borrow money. You go to the bank. We borrowed $56 million and through a special state agency called the Trust for Cultural Resources that allowed us to issue triple tax exempt, AAA rated bonds. I won't go into that, but for an institution that only had a $26 million endowment to take on a $56 million liability, I don't think it's a deal that could be done these days. In fact, I know that it can't. But it was something that engendered a tremendous amount of controversy about the Guggenheim. And the issue also was that if we didn't do it at that time, we couldn't have done it in the future because we did it a year before the building was landmarked. And once it became landmarked, we couldn't have touched it even if we wanted to improve it. So the institution felt that it was under a particularly, it was an important time pressure that we had to react to, and we took a particularly adventurous course to solve that problem. The Guggenheim, as Wes pointed out, also operated a museum in Venice, and while we were expanding in New York, we had to reduce our building program uptown to get the building built. We decided we would do contemporary art downtown, and so we opened up a museum in Soho. But the point was that circa 1988 and 1989, we started to launch the museum in a somewhat forward direction in very, very modest steps, improving our own physical facility and at least setting up the institution that it could do some serious programming. I think the key for us actually began to develop, and it wasn't a strategy that was clear in the beginning, but we began to look at Venice. In Venice, we had, with the Peggy Guggenheim collection, a very small museum. It's on the Grand Canal. It's the one actually with the lights on right here. It's only about 5,000 square feet of exhibition space. The logic was we thought this was an opportunity to challenge the structural element of museum operations. If we could in fact build a building in Venice that was roughly the same size as the museum that we had in New York, the logic went there would be an economy of scale. You had a big audience in Venice of about 11 million tourist visitors a year. That tourist audience plus combined with New York programming, we'd be able in effect to reduce our operating costs by distributing them over a wider base. At least that was the idea. We looked around Venice for quite a while, wanted to try to find something on Piazza San Marco, which is, of course, the sort of meeting point of all of Venice. Every tourist that comes to Venice comes here. There was nothing available around here, but our eyes fell on this triangular building right across the Grand Canal. This is the Peggy Guggenheim collection right here, our palazzo on the Grand Canal. So we set out in a campaign to acquire the building, Punta della Dogana, by embarking on a negotiation with the Italian government in 1988. 11 years later, no movement, but we did sign an agreement with the Comune, the city of Venice, to take over this facility for a 99-year lease to create a Guggenheim Museum of Modern Art in Venice. The problem we've run into recently is we just discovered that there are a lot of nuns in this section of the building here because this is a convent right on the other side, and people weren't paying attention to the fact that somehow the nuns had kind of like crossed the line over the years, and about 1/3 of the space is filled with nuns. And so we have this negotiation now with the Patriarch of Venice to try to swap some space in another location so in fact we could have this building. But this is a discussion that goes on, and there's another message here: you never give up no matter what happens, just keep on going. I mean, Venice is Venice, but Venice launched us in a direction that was very important to the institution, and there were a series of initiatives that had to do with the Frank Lloyd Wright building, seeking to develop Venice, that began to, I mean, certainly made the Guggenheim controversial, but began to capture a lot of attention. Now, simultaneous to the building, you had to look at the collection. We had a great early 20th century collection. Not so strong post-war. The Guggenheim was founded as a museum of non-objective art based on Kandinsky and artists like Brancusi. We've probably got two of the strongest concentrations, about 150 works by Kandinsky still in the collection, and about 15 major sculptures by Brancusi. Makes us one of the strongest museums of any in the world for this kind of activity. In the 1950s, the museum, under its second director, James Johnson Sweeney began to collect representational painting. In fact, we bought this Cezanne, I think, in 1952 for $32,000, which was quite a buy. And then my predecessor, Tom Messer, was able to negotiate with Peggy Guggenheim, the Peggy Guggenheim collection coming to the Solomon R. Guggenheim Foundation. This is a Picasso painting from 1936, but that's probably one of the greatest collections of early 20th century surrealist art in the world. So we had this kind of early 20th century non-objective painting, classical to a certain extent from Impressionism, and the surrealist collection of Peggy Guggenheim, but we were not particularly strong post-war. So we did something radical, I suppose, at the time, is that I proposed to the Board of Trustees that we sell 2 pictures, or 3 pictures actually, to buy the Ponza di Bumo collection. We sold a Kandinsky from 1911, a Modigliani, and a Chagall. As I said before, we had 6 Kandinskys from the same year. This was a painting we hadn't shown, I think, but twice in 30 years. We had a Modigliani that was almost like the one that you see on the screen. They were very close. And the Chagall was a reprise of the Chagall that was at the Museum of Modern Art. There was a lot of controversy about this. We decided to do this publicly at auction and offered, Sotheby's put a bid range of $18 to $21 million on it. We were excoriated in the press. It was talked about a lot. I was selling off the collection, selling the assets of the museum. The 3 paintings went at auction for $47 million. And with the $47 million, in other words, we bid the price up by doing it publicly and being criticized for it, we were able to buy 300 works of American art from the Ponza di Bumo collection, of which another 100 were given as a gift, and we acquired a big block of about 65 works by Joseph Beuys, and many works by Andy Warhol and others. In fact, we built the post-war collection to the Guggenheim in a 2-year period to one of the finest collections of any post-war museum in the world. I mean, our depth in this area, particularly in American art, is absolutely extraordinary. And that, coupled with the buildings, started to move us in the direction of developing the institution's footprint, you might say, and perhaps even awareness, maybe even brand awareness. The other thing that we did was very aggressively was to build the museum's program. I mean, I see the museum having a kind of double-edged function. On the one hand, to collect, preserve, and present objects of material culture and to do it well. But secondly, I take its educational and its storytelling function very seriously. What curators can do is look at objects of material culture and put them together in convincing narratives backed by solid research and make that information easy and accessible for the widest possible audience. And to do this on a fairly ambitious scale. So we made a huge investment in staff development at the time. We went from organizing perhaps roughly 1 exhibition a year to organizing about 15 exhibitions a year. And I was telling a group of people I was talking with earlier that you can think of us now something like a film production company that to do a big scale exhibition probably has a budget somewhere between $4 and $8 million. We do, let's say, 15 of these a year. The lead time is 3 to 4 years. That means that we're running 60 projects at a time. And every project has separate funding sources. Every project has a separate curator, separate storylines. They have all implementation requirements, but it takes a very, very large and aggressive staff to run this kind of program. And what we were doing was gearing up for the evolution of the museum from a local institution to a truly international one. So exhibitions like the Russian and Soviet avant-garde, which we did in 1982, a very large exhibition, or 1992. This is on the right is an early Max Beckmann exhibition, which even my old nemesis Hilton Kramer said was the best exhibition that he'd seen in New York in the last 15 years. We did major monographic exhibitions, Robert Rauschenberg, Ellsworth Kelly in the Guggenheim, Roy Lichtenstein and Jenny Holzer. We began to use the architecture of the Frank Lloyd Wright building in a very engaging way, and the audience began to build for the museum. I mean, we started out with about a 350,000 a year visitorship. We're now up to about 1.1 million, and I think that the people are coming to the Guggenheim for a combination of reasons. It has to do with the prosperity popularity, it has to do with general mobility, but it also has to do with the quality of the programming and the fact that the programming that takes place at the Guggenheim is in fact reaching a larger audience. So this investment in building, local building, collection and programming were a very important foundation for creating a platform for moving into the 21st century. Now, the free radical, the unintended development probably took place in 1989 in Salzburg because, as it happened, to make a long story short, the Chancellor of Austria and the mayor of Salzburg had read about the Guggenheim wanting to expand in Venice, and they proposed instead that the Guggenheim build a museum in Salzburg. Now, I happen to know Salzburg. If any of you have seen Sound of Music, you too know Salzburg. You remember the Festspiele house where Julie Andrews and the Von Trapp family sing. But the proposal was to build a Guggenheim Museum there. I said, no, bad idea, too much music. I can't imagine where it would be. Too close to Venice. I wasn't interested. A year or so later, I went to Salzburg for another reason. I was presented the project by Hans Hollein. I won't go into this, but I changed my mind in about 30 seconds because the proposal was to build a museum of about 250,000 square feet entirely inside a rock. There is this geological formation, a rock escarpment, that sort of surrounds like a half moon the large part of this Italian Baroque city. And it's almost a straight up escarpment, and on the top of it is a park. The notion was to build a museum inside the rock so that in the park on the top there would be a lake of skylights. And in fact, what you're seeing here is the top floor of the museum with the skylights taken off, but there is this big central atrium of about 150 feet, which is about 2/3 the height of the Guggenheim's atrium in New York. But you couldn't see this museum at all. It was completely hidden. Now, this notion, this whole idea of an invisible museum inside the rock, about 200 yards from where Mozart was born, in the city of Mozart, the city of music, I thought it was a seriously cool idea. We undertook the feasibility study, and the analysis held up. The economic impact was there. The government was prepared to spend the money. And moreover, the government had a reason and a rationale for doing this. If you recall, at the time, Kurt Waldheim was president of Austria, persona non grata in the United States. Michael Gorbachev was the president of the Soviet Union, and everybody thought he'd be around for 20 years. Because Waldheim could not travel to the U.S. and Austria was not a member of the EEC, it was a matter of Austrian foreign policy to make this alliance. An American museum with a Jewish name on a cultural issue was a way, in fact, of deflecting some of the criticism that they had because they couldn't fire Waldheim. So all of a sudden, from our standpoint, this looked reasonably good. And keep in mind, I'm taking a very complex situation, and I'm sort of packaging it quickly to fit into this kind of presentation. What happened was that right at the time we were about to go forward with Austria, the Soviet Union started to fall apart. And the first thing that happened then was that all of the economic refugees from Yugoslavia and actually from Czechoslovakia and Eastern Germany and Hungary came to the Austrian border. And overnight, you couldn't get a parking space in Vienna. I mean, literally overnight. And there went the public support for a $200 million project. Vernitsky lost his mandate to develop this position for Austria, and the Guggenheim was sort of left outside, kind of like holding the bag. At the same time, we did 4 projects in Asia, and we were all approached, again, for the same reason. People read about the Guggenheim in Venice. They then read about Salzburg. This was one project to build a museum at the top of this tower, actually 120,000 square foot exhibition space on the top 2 floors of a 60-story building, each floor being double height. You had skylight, terrific views of the city of Tokyo, Mount Fuji. Well, we all know what happened to the Japanese real estate bubble in 1992 in the Japanese economy, and that project, as well as 3 others in Asia, were heading in the wrong direction. So circa 1991, 1992, my record at the Guggenheim is not looking very good. And if some of you followed this at all and knew that there was also another project that I was involved with, which was the conversion of a 28-building factory complex in North Adams, Massachusetts, which to make it a museum of contemporary art, for which the state had allocated $35 million. The headline says it all, that the Mass MoCA funding bill was killed, and it was largely regarded as one of my boondoggles. I'll give you a fast forward. Mass MoCA opened last year, but I'm not going to talk about that. But circa 1990, but the point that I want to make is that there's a reality to this process, and the reality to this process is that the Guggenheim was at the center of extreme controversy in 1991, 1992. I sold masterpieces, so I was giving away the collection. We did a bond issue without an endowment, for which everybody was roundly criticizing that. The expansion plans were largely regarded as a fiasco. And I think if you were to take bets on whether I would survive a year or two, you would not have had many people supporting my position. Then came Bilbao. Bilbao was hardly a slam dunk from the first moment. We had also been looking at a project, and you get the sort of the drill now here, that we had become a kind of the investment bankers of the cultural world, is that governments and institutions knew that we were in play to try to implement our strategy of international expansion. And I was directed to a meeting with the president of the province of the Basque Country. It's one of 13 provinces in Spain in the north. That's the president right there. In fact, this is the very day. That's a younger-looking me on the right. It was April 9th, 1991, the first time I went to Bilbao, and their proposal, I thought, was preposterous. Build an art museum in this industrial town whose major industry had been steel, the manufacture of steel and the building of ships, and both of those industries had left. And so it was a kind of Pittsburgh before the Renaissance, and it was a tough situation. On top of that, when the president of the Basque Country suggested to me that the Guggenheim come there, I said, I had to confess my ignorance that I hardly knew where the place was before I looked on a map. And if I had made a list of 100 cities, I certainly wouldn't have put Bilbao on it as a place that we would want to go. And beyond that, I said that it's terrorism and highlight. Those are the two associations that I have with your place, although I know that that's not fair. But it also happens to be true. It's not exactly the place that you would see lots of tourists prepared to go. The president, Mr. Ardonza, then said something that I thought was very interesting. He said, well, you have a misapprehension of our country, to which I readily agreed. He said, put that aside for a moment. What would it take to build a Guggenheim Museum in Bilbao? Now keep in mind that we had just done 4 or 5 feasibility studies, and so we sort of knew what the numbers were. And I wasn't interested in impressing anybody, so I was pretty straightforward. I said, well, you'd have to think about building the greatest building of the 20th century. I said, think of the Sydney Opera House and think of Centre Pompidou, and then think better. We got to do something better than that. And I said, it'll probably cost about $150 million. You have to build it, you have to buy it, you have to own it. The second thing is that the Guggenheim would operate it, but we would need an endowment from the government of at least $10 million a year. So you could capitalize that as a $100 million endowment. Thirdly, it would be run by the Guggenheim with the Guggenheim's collection and program, but that I would need another $50 million for acquisitions. Fourth, you want us to risk our name and our reputation in Bilbao. It would take a $20 million fee payable up front to the Guggenheim and non-refundable if the project collapsed. So if you add all this up, we're at $320. Then I said, we'd have to pick the architect. You understand by now that I'm not trying to convince him to do this. We would have to pick the architect, and we would have to pick the site. I said, I'm sure you have a site, but it's probably not very good. And we would have to have complete design control in doing this. And believe it or not, it was as simple as that. I mean, when I said that, he put his hand across the table and said, you've got a deal. Well, we did our homework. I was staggered by that and didn't believe it, because he actually wanted to sign a contract, a memorandum of understanding then and there at that first meeting, which I resisted. Went back and did a little homework in Bilbao and found something that I thought was very interesting. First of all, the Basque region of Spain, as it turns out, is the most profitable region of Spain on a per capita basis. I mean, its gross national product on a per capita basis is the highest of Spain. They claim that about a third of the CEOs of major Spanish corporations went to business school in Bilbao. The Basques are fiercely independent, but moreover, this is a region that was at war with Franco for 50 years. And when Franco died in 1976, the Basques negotiated fiscal autonomy. That is, that they don't pay taxes to the central government. They pay a fee for certain services, but they retain the power of local taxation, which basically means that if you have the highest per capita GNP of any region in Spain and you do the taxation and you only pay a fee to the central government for certain services, you have a higher level of retained earnings, which means that you have a higher credit rating, which means that you can do large-scale public finance in the international public finance markets. And what they were doing is they were building a new subway system that cost $1 billion, designed by Norman Foster. Santiago Calatrava designed a new airport, which opened this year. James Sterling was hired to do the new train station. And this notion, the quickness with which the president, agreed to the deal with the Guggenheim, was basically backed up by a fairly significant industrial policy that was already in place. And it gradually became clear to me, it didn't become clear right away, but it gradually became clear to me that not only could it be Bilbao, but it could only be Bilbao, about the only situation that actually could support the kind of program or project that we had described was actually occurring right here. So, well, anyway, a deal was done. There's a picture of the mayor of New York, David Dinkins, when we signed the agreement with the mayor of Bilbao and the president of the Basque Country and the chairman of the Guggenheim. We hired Frank Gehry to do the architectural design. I flew over Bilbao in a helicopter and picked out this site because I like this bridge, and this was one of the original port areas of Bilbao. This river actually is an estuary that goes about 5 miles to the Atlantic, and the port of Bilbao now is the second largest port in Europe in area, and I think the 6th largest in tonnage. This is a drawbridge over here, and this bridge actually is quite high, and ocean-going ships could come under here. And you can see this was a railhead. So what we wanted actually was this site right here. And sure enough, they acquired the site. I mean, they said, fine. We started doing designing. I won't go into this in a long description. I could talk about this for hours, but I'll show you very quickly. Frank Gehry is a paper architect. He doesn't work with pencil and paper. He began sort of like cutting out pieces of cardboard and sort of twisting them around. And from the cardboard shapes, I mean, in fact, the reason that the museum in Bilbao was able to occur at all had to do with sophisticated computer-assisted design technology. Frank Gehry wouldn't know a computer if it hit him on the head, but fortunately he's got a lot of very smart people that work with him, and they had come up with a system called the CATIA system that was used by the French aerospace industry to design aircraft, particularly the Mirage fighter plane. It was a Dassault system. And the idea was that if you went back to that prior image, which I think I can do, and you had a tool which is a little bit like an electric theodolite, and it's like a dentist drill. You click it on one edge and you kind of go down the curve and hit the next point and click it, and then go down to the next one and click it, and go down to the next one and click it, and you keep on traveling the model. What you'll get is an image eventually like this, where the computer puts it into 3 dimensions. And that from that 3-dimensional rough drawing, the computer will take it through successive systems of refinement, where it begins to kind of shape the topographical surfaces. And you could actually go back into the drawing right here and pull on certain point, click on a point and pull it off, and the whole thing would automatically smooth. So it becomes a kind of smooth, continuous surface. You could actually go back in and work into the drawings, and you could eventually take the you work toward a more sophisticated system of three-dimensional modeling, but you could eventually take the computer programming, put it into an electronic milling machine, actually, and mill the parts of the model. All this is being done with paper and computers. I mean, there's not a pencil that touches the entire process. And what happens, as you can see here, this is the actual final model of the museum in Bilbao, and that's the museum. And the two things are absolutely exact. The computer also produces the working drawings automatically. 11,000 pieces of steel in the Guggenheim Museum in Bilbao. No two are alike. Only two had to be refabricated. So a building of absolutely stunning complexity was able to be realized on time and under budget, which was actually one of my deals with the president of the Basque Country. We had control of the design of the project as long as we stayed on time and under budget. And we finished the project on time and about the 1% under the budget, which was a remarkable thing for a building as unusual as the museum in Bilbao. Just a couple little anecdotes about the building. I mean, the design process was a little bit different than most. We started out early on by trying to come up with images that could define the building. One of the images was sailing ships, because Bilbao was a maritime culture. So you can see the image of sailing ships and how that was integrated into some of the final shapes of Bilbao. Another one was Brancusi's studio, and that these large shapes and plaster shapes in Brancusi's studio actually were the inspiration for the atrium of the museum in Bilbao. And those are actually people down there that you can see, and if you look very carefully, you can see the King and Queen of Spain, who were there for the opening of the museum. But the central atrium is 180 feet high, which means you could put a 17-story building in it. So it has this overpowering scale that when you go to the museum for the first time, you're just staggered by it. You're staggered by its context, you're staggered by its curves, its reflective sheen, its titanium cover, and the interior spaces, in fact, are even better than the exterior spaces. The third image was Fritz Lang's Metropolis, this whole idea of the kind of sophisticated city of the future. This is actually a photograph of the rotunda from the floor looking up, but you can see there are all these walkways on the second and the third and the fourth floor that connect around the atrium that give you this vertiginous experience. So the whole thing becomes like a sophisticated theme park for art, as well as a perfect platform for the presentation of 20th century culture. A couple of pictures of Bilbao. It looks as good at night as it does during the day. And if you're down one of the major streets, you turn a corner, you're all of a sudden confronted with this view, sort of like framed by the corridor of the street. This titanium masterpiece arises. In every way, this project has been a tremendous success. And if you needed to know, one of the things that I started out with, that things change. Here's a picture of Bilbao 100 years ago, or at the beginning of the 20th century, and here's the same site right now. So things do move along. Bilbao has been a huge success. We anticipated 450,000 visitors. The press said we'd never get more than 200,000. We had 1.4 million the first year. We've averaged 1.3 million since then. It's created 7,000 permanent jobs in the Basque Country. It generates $45 million a year in tax revenues for the Basque government, which makes their investment, $350 million investment, actually a pretty good deal. It's about a 15% return. And you just don't get that for municipal projects. It's completely transformed the image of the Basque Country. It's now a tourist destination. It seems like a week doesn't go by when you don't read about it in the New York Times. And it's just had an astonishing impact, not only on the field of architecture and the field of museums, but also on the field of museum directors. If it wasn't for Frank Gehry and Bilbao, I wouldn't be invited to Ball State to give this talk tonight, that's for sure. And I'm very much aware of how important this was to what the Guggenheim was doing. I mean, it was like persistence, 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 and then all of a sudden you hit the home run. With the $50 million, we bought great art, and I won't spend a lot of time with it, but we bought a huge, great Yves Klein from 1962. We bought about 10 Anselm Kiefer paintings. We filled up that large gallery in Bilbao that you see on the right with Andy Warhol and Jim Rosenquist and some Carl Andre pieces that we purchased to complement what we owned, including the Richard Serra sculpture in the middle, which we also purchased. We commissioned this Jeff Koons sculpture, a 45-foot puppy dog, which is perpetually flowering outside the Guggenheim in Bilbao. And I could tell you a long story about that and the tremendous opposition to it. Now there is not a single christening or wedding that doesn't culminate in Bilbao in front of the puppy dog. And it's planted 3 times a year. Each time its flower configuration changes, and it's become a symbol for the city. So you have a city that goes from being known for terrorism to being known for museums and puppy dogs. And it's been an amazing transformation and also a statement about what culture can do. Now, while this is going on, we also negotiated a small Guggenheim in Berlin, which is partly because it's the opposite of Bilbao. A tiny space, it's only 4,000 square feet, on the ground floor of a bank building, but it's on a very fancy street, Unter den Linden, the crossing of Unter den Linden and the Friedrichstrasse, which is like 57th Street and 5th Avenue in New York City. We got Deutsche Bank to give us $5 million a year for acquisition, for which we commission new works of art. The deal is they pay all the expenses. We get half ownership in all the work. We run the program, make the choices of the artists, and implement the project. You can see the opening of this exhibition. This is a major triptych, it's a 98-foot painting, a 42-foot painting, and a 20-foot painting done by James Rosenquist, which now the Guggenheim is a proud 50% owner with Deutsche Bank. So we've been running this program now for 3 years. We just renewed it for another 5 on top of the original 5. So that basically means that over that period of time, we would have spent $50 million on commissions of new works of art, to which the Guggenheim has possession of them all, but that these works will actually then fit into the kind of circulation model of the Guggenheim and be seen at all of the different museums. Programming, we sort of stepped up the pace, and there was a radical departure for us in 1996 when we decided that the Guggenheim would no longer focus simply on 20th century and contemporary art, but that everything was possible for us, anything in cultural history at any place, anywhere in the world. And the first major project was called China 5,000 Years. I went to Cleveland, invited Sherman Lee, who I regarded to be the great scholar of American scholar of Chinese art history, to be the curator. I went to Beijing and met with the foreign minister and basically said the Metropolitan Museum is going to do an exhibition of imperial treasures from China, all from the museum in Taiwan. Now, we can't let that happen. And I also knew from reading National Geographic that China has probably been the richest archaeological site in the world, and that none of this material had ever been in the U.S. before. Actually, both suppositions, or all 3, were true. Sherman was interested in doing it. The Chinese government was absolutely interested in doing it. And we were able to negotiate an exhibition of extraordinary material from the People's Republic of China that had the skeptics lining up before we did it. How the Guggenheim could ever do something, pretend to do something in this field without having a collection. We actually did it better than the Met. We had a huge attendance for this. In New York and Bilbao, over 1.2 million people saw it at both locations combined. And it set a new standard for exhibition scholarship for the Guggenheim. We had Arata Isazaki, the Japanese artist, essentially build these gallery spaces that you see both uptown and downtown. And we took 5,000 years of Chinese cultural history, and it was a hugely impactful show for the Guggenheim. And then following the exhibition of China 5,000 Years came the art of the motorcycle. 125 motorcycles from 1868 to the present, done with the same kind of curatorial integrity, energy, intensity, skill, and cost that we devoted to China. Frank Gehry did the installation in New York where he coated the entire Guggenheim Museum on the inside in stainless steel. The criteria for selecting the motorcycles was very rigorous, 1 a year from 1868 to the present. The choices in each year were a function of design, let's say technological innovation, extraordinary design, and social impact. In the summer of 1998, this was the best attended exhibition on a daily basis that we'd ever had at the Guggenheim. We had at a rate of about 1.7 million visitors a year. Actually, about 400,000 people saw it in New York. And it set a standard for this kind of exhibition. In fact, usually for an exhibition, you're lucky if you sell, we used to be lucky if we sold 2,000 catalogs. Now on a very good exhibition, we're up to 10. For the motorcycle exhibition, so far we've sold 100,000 catalogs at $50 for the soft cover and $75 for the hard cover. So you can see we're in the publishing business here. We've made a big investment in technology and art and technology. I won't go into that, but it's something that we do. The level of our programming now is very special. We do things that can't be done elsewhere. You see this big Richard Serra sculpture exhibition, 9 sculptures, each one weighing 176 tons. It's one of the most beautiful sculpture exhibitions I've ever seen anywhere in this pristine white Frank Gehry 465-foot long space in Bilbao, and yet we have the capacity in the very same room to a year later put the art of the motorcycle and reach over 800,000 visitors in Bilbao just to see this motorcycle exhibition in Bilbao. So what's happened then is that as this is happening, what was going on inside the institution was an ever more sophisticated understanding of exactly what we were doing. We understood that the Guggenheim was becoming a brand, and that there were assets that were parked under that brand, and that we had to manage that brand very carefully. And I would say you're looking now at analysis that was taking place 1996, 1997, as we began to think how we were going to try to manage this growth and actually take the institution from a local institution into an international institution. And a key part of that strategy was seeing ourselves with a global mission but with a local spirit. It was not about McDonald's. It was not about trying to replicate something that worked in one place, but actually working with local communities and, in fact, becoming a Basque and Spanish museum in Bilbao, a German museum in Berlin, and an Italian museum in Venice. And we've been able to accomplish that, I think, quite successfully. And in part, that's the key to our success. We have a strong audience because we also speak to our audience, and we bring this audience into a discussion and a dialogue with the institution. Now, about 2 years ago, we began to think, I suppose there's a conventional term here, sort of outside the box. We began to think about the Guggenheim a new way. We hired a friend of mine who's in the advertising business who has some fairly big accounts, and we wanted to try to take a look at the Guggenheim through a different kind of lens. So we approached it this way. Could we think of all the things that the Guggenheim wasn't? So if you can imagine a museum in constant motion, if you could imagine a museum with no walls, if you can imagine that the Guggenheim is not a place, but that the Guggenheim is a point of view, if you can imagine that the Guggenheim is everything that you can imagine, and that the Guggenheim is the agent of popular culture, and if you can think of all of these things, and you can even believe a part of them, it begins to open up the thinking of the institution. You no longer think about how you manage the institution like it used to be, but how you want to take the institution to a place where it's going to be, where it doesn't exist right now. And that was very important for us to make another critical leap in the planning of the institution, which was, imagine your own museum. And if I could imagine my own museum, I imagined the Manhattan Project of museums. Wes referred to this as this exhibition of actually the presentation of what I call the Manhattan Project. My handlers are now telling me I've got to call it the New York Project because the Manhattan Project's a bit too aggressive in terms of its reference to the development of the atomic bomb. But the issue for the Manhattan Project sort of came out of that kind of thinking. If we could imagine, based on our experience of Bilbao and the direction that the institution was going, the end of the road rather than a sort of step in the road, and then saw the end of the road become the step in the road, what would that next step, end step, look like? So we did a program. New museum, New York City. Guggenheim is small downtown. It's got to be on the waterfront. We knew that. It had to have 65,000 square feet for a permanent collection, 50,000 for special exhibitions. Had to have a new Department of Architecture and Design like no other in the world, because I don't think there's really a great museum of architecture and design. Had to have a Center for Art and Technology. Had to have 10,000 square feet of exhibition space for children's art on a permanent basis. Office space, behind the scenes, performing arts set, et cetera, et cetera. It totaled out to 572,000 square feet, about twice the size of Bilbao and about 3 times the volume. The site we found, perfect location, right off Wall Street. That's Wall Street right there. These 4 piers, as it happened, were the subject of an RFP, a request for proposal issued by the City of New York, for which we filed a response. I tried to find another architect, but I couldn't. I mean, I like Frank's curves. I mean, we worked well together. It's kind of like Abbott and Costello, you know, Laurel and Hardy. I'm the tall one, Frank's the short one. I'm the one without the hair. He's the one with the wavy hair. Frank and I have become a kind of an act. And for that reason, I wanted to do it with somebody else, but at the end of the day, I couldn't because I looked around and I flew over New York in a helicopter. And then I saw this picture of the New York City skyscrapers of Lower Manhattan in the 1930s, and I said, that's it. We have to make a piece of poetry that addresses the architecture of Lower Manhattan on a colossal scale that serves the institution and the direction that the institution wants to go. So we worked and we made about 50 of these things, kind of like paper models, where we just piled up paper and piled up cardboard. And what came out of that was literally this discussion. You know, the specific image metaphor for the building must derive from its immediate context on the waterfront. The 2 things that defined the waterfront were the water and the skyscrapers. So let's make it a skyscraper emerging from the fog or a cloud, a condition that you can see sometimes, you know, early in the morning in lower Manhattan. That ice skating rink and look up. This is what you would see looking up. The building is actually a donut. I mean, it's done in a figure 8 configuration to bring natural light into the park down below, reflecting off the titanium. It's a $900 million project. The chairman of the Guggenheim has committed $250 million to the project of his own money. And as it happens right now, Wes got it right. It's letters to Mayor Giuliani. It's not the money. We basically think that we have the money to build this project. So, what's become of the Guggenheim? It's gone from being a single institution with a single definition to something more ambiguous, something more amorphous, something more flexible, something more international, something more spontaneous than it used to be. And we consciously see ourselves evolving in that direction. But a couple of things were lacking, that the structure was threatening to outstrip the content, or at least so I thought. So I went out and looked for a partner, and the partner that I found was in St. Petersburg. I mean, I basically made a short list of the greatest museums in the world, the Metropolitan, the Louvre, and the Hermitage. And the only one that was available for a joint venture, a marriage, so to speak, was the Hermitage. So on the 20th of June in 2000, about 3 months ago, the Guggenheim and the Hermitage got married. And the Hermitage, in case you haven't been to St. Petersburg, is the former winter and summer palace of the Tsars on the Neva River off Palace Square. It's a collection of 3 million objects that cover every conceivable, or not every conceivable, but most points of human art history. There are parts of these collections are in the Hermitage. That's the entrance to the palace. The Hermitage has great Rubens, has great Rembrandts, has one of the finest French Impressionist collections you'll ever see, the 268 paintings from the Shukin-Morozov collection. It has terrific porcelain and decorative arts, Islamic, Asian. It's simply one of the greatest museums in the world. we decided that we would get together with the Hermitage. Here we are signing the marriage agreements. That's myself, the chairman of the Guggenheim, the Minister of Culture of the Russian Federation, and Michael Piotrowski, the director of the Guggenheim. At dinner later that night, Mr. Piotrowski and I toasting. The Guggenheim will take on, with the Hermitage, the development of what's called the Greater Hermitage Project, which is this building. The Hermitage is right here. Across Palace Square is an early 19th century building designed by Carlo Rossi to be the Ministry of Defense and the Foreign Ministry for Russia under the Tsars. It's about 500,000 square feet, 610 rooms. The Hermitage this will become a Guggenheim Hermitage Museum. The Hermitage will transfer their Impressionist collection, the Shuka-Morozov collection, the Empire 19th Century Decorative Arts collection, and all of their porcelain and porcelain study collections. We will do 20th century art, contemporary art, technology, architecture, design, and photography. We expect that we will have this building operating in about 5 years. One of our architects, the architects on the team are Rem Koolhaas, is here, and Frank Gehry, and probably Jean Nouvel. We are going to take this area and fill up the courtyards in the middle of the building with a new building. This is actually my drawing with Piotrowski's notes on it that set out the original scope of that project. We will fill this blue building in here. It'll create a double-height exhibition space for special projects inside the courtyards of the General Staff Building. And we believe that we'll make the Hermitage one of the greatest museums on earth. And because we needed to get this endorsed by the Ministry of Culture and that they did not want to take the responsibility for it, we invited this gentleman to come and bless the project. And he came to the Guggenheim last week, and Mr. Piotrowski, who is over here, was pointing out just what section of the Guggenheim in New York would be the Hermitage Museum in New York City. So we're going to do in other words, we've entwined our destinies. The Guggenheim is going to be a partner in St. Petersburg. St. Petersburg is going to be a partner in New York. And we are going to do projects in other locations in the world together. Because with our programming expertise and capacity and 20th century collection and their everything else prior to the 20th century, it makes a very powerful combination. So once you've reached at this point, what do you do next? Las Vegas. Las Vegas is the ultimate fantasy city, the ultimate fantasy place. When Las Vegas started coming after us about a year ago, I was not buying, I was not at all interested, and by this time there's a message here. When I say that I'm not interested, something usually develops. If I really like it, it probably kills the project right away. I went to Las Vegas for the first time last January, and I came away with a couple of things. I learned that the sun is out 340 days a year. I thought that was impressive. I learned that it's the fastest growing city in America with 3.5 million people and a new school being built every month. I learned that 40 million tourist visitors a year come to Las Vegas and that only 20% gamble. I learned that there were 57 golf courses and that the biggest industries now in Las Vegas are restaurants, shopping, and entertainment. And they got a great canyon ranch there, too, I found out. So we decided to build a Guggenheim Hermitage in Las Vegas. And we're going to do it at the Venetian Hotel. This is the Venetian. I mean, as you can see, what's more appropriate? Peggy Guggenheim, after all. And the notion is this is a very bad drawing, but I took the wrong slide, but this is the Strip in Las Vegas, and this is the big driveway where you get dropped off at the front of the Venetian, and then you go into this kind of Italianate rotunda here to the admissions desk, and then you go from the admissions desk to the elevators over here. You have to go past the casino. All of this is the casino on the ground level. And this is the front of that porch. The porch is right here where the cars come up. And right in the front of this, we're going to build a 5,000 square foot Guggenheim Hermitage Museum designed by Rem Koolhaas, who's this year's Pritzker Prize winner. And that building will be a 130 foot by 15 foot Corten steel facade. right across the front and extending the facade of the building out. It's as if you took this box, and you'll see this on the next photograph. We're actually building a steel box of 4 galleries and literally just forcing it into the front of the facade of the Venetian. In other words, it has absolutely nothing to do with the architecture of the place. Nothing at all. It's just steel, rusted steel, inside and out. And what we will do there are masterpieces from the Guggenheim Hermitage, the Art of Fabergé, the Golden Horde, Rubens and Rembrandt, Kandinsky and Klee, early Picasso. Between the two of us, we can have a program there that we believe will actually be drop dead, because I love to do this on a sort of small scale. The small scale exhibition. And we anticipate, if you do the numbers here just for a second, and 4,000 visitors a day times $15 a ticket times $5 for retail, it's $80,000 a day, $500,000 a week, $26 million a year, divided by take out $6 million for operation, it leaves us 20. What are we going to do with that 20? We're going to invest it back in St. Petersburg and rebuild the Hermitage and the General Staff Building. So there's a kind of Robin Hood element to our enterprise here. And no, this is very serious. This is absolutely serious, because the issue is you do several things here. First of all, we're not playing down to this audience. That we are absolutely going to do our very best masterpieces. And I can tell you it's going to stimulate curiosity. People are going to want to see this. And they're going to want to see this in a Rem Koolhaas building that is a slash across the artificial facade of Las Vegas. It's an art brute authenticity, which is a very, very powerful philosophical statement. And that's what I'm trying to get at here, is that we know how to play this game, which is part of what we do, but the reality is that it's driven by poetry, because actually Las Vegas is the total reverse of Bilbao. Because Bilbao, you basically took a rusting city and you put this elegant, kind of curvaceous, linear, lyrical architecture in on a powerful scale, very big scale. And in Las Vegas, you take this thing which is all big scale, fake, facade, false, sort of flowering, lights, all that stuff, and you do the absolute reverse. You take a tiny little jewel box of a steel building and you basically jam the building right across the facade of the hotel. And this is what the interior of the hotel looks like, by the way. So where now you see these colonnades, just inside those colonnades you will see one solid piece of steel, 130 feet long, and subtly etched into it in 10-foot letters, but just a little bit of shade difference will say, if you look very, very carefully, Hermitage Guggenheim Museum on the outside, Guggenheim Hermitage Museum on the inside. We think that the brands and the quality of the programming, and we also intend that the programming that we show in Las Vegas will also be seen in New York and in St. Petersburg. So we think that this is something that is actually going to have a fairly substantial input on what goes on. Guggenheim Hermitage Museum, you get a sense of what it looks like. So I'm getting close to the end of this. I've gone quickly. Oh, I forgot. We're going to do something else in Las Vegas, too. A 65,000 square foot exhibition space that's basically one room that's 70 feet high, 210 feet long, and 160 feet wide. Also designed by Rem Koolhaas on a vacant lot that abuts the hotel. This is a sense of that room. It has a big trench down the middle which we can cover over. You can see the floor covering it here. We can take it up for exhibition space. There are galleries on either side. The door itself is 70 feet high. There's huge skylights on the top. You can see over here. When we open up the skylights, we have Michelangelo's Sistine ceiling, which you'll be able to see from the hotel rooms as you look down. I'm sorry. That's the Sistine ceiling. And we're going to put the art of the motorcycle in there. Frank Gehry's design for the motorcycle exhibition. That'll open next May. You can do the arithmetic here, too. We're expecting about 10,000 visitors a day, because 52,000 visitors go through the Venetian Hotel every day through their shopping mall. And we'll do the art of the motorcycle better than we did it in New York or Bilbao. So we will have two facilities in Las Vegas this time next year. And I think they're going to have a big impact on what we do. The Guggenheim is very aggressive in on the technology side of things. We were about to announce a private joint venture with a group of venture capital partners for Guggenheim.com with substantial funding. We're creating a portal for all of culture, for everything. I mean, that's the sort of parameters of this. I can't go into it, I mean, in detail. We don't have that much time. What's the glue that holds all this together? It's the Guggenheim Motorcycle Club. This is a group that came together in 1998. You see, as it happens, I'm the president of the Guggenheim Motorcycle Club. I'm right here. These are my vice presidents, Jeremy Irons, Lawrence Fishburne, Lauren Hutton, Dennis Hopper, Bob Geldorf, and here's our technical advisor, Alton Guilfoyle. We do about 4 rides a year. Here we are in St. Petersburg last June after the signing. This is Jeremy and I in Palace Square. This was Jeremy and Frank Gehry. That's Frank in the red hat on the back. In Bilbao last year. The motorcycle rides become a very important part of the Guggenheim culture. We now have about 30 members in our club. Our next big ride takes place, well, our biggest ride takes place next year in September when we're going from Shanghai to Xi'an to Urumqi, which is on the northern Silk Road in China. It's a 16-day ride that'll cover 3,000 kilometers. But there's a special kind of like camaraderie about all of this, and basically what you get to at the end of the day is that, you know, the Guggenheim is an asset. It's a powerful brand. We've made it stronger, but at the end of the day, it's the people that make it go. I'm smart enough to know at least that, as I said, no Bill Baum, no Frank Gehry, no Tom Krens at Ball State. That having people like Frank, Rem Koolhaas, Jean Nouvel, having great curators to work with, we have a lot of fun because we've basically looked at the institution. We've tried to expand the institution in ways that are relevant and international. We're looking at South America. We're looking at Asia. We're looking at Africa. And I think the thing is that we try to contain this within our ability to manage it. We're still, we believe, a relatively small institution as you compare this to sort of corporate structure and corporate size, but one that has, I think, a proportionate and even predominant impact. That our ability to program now and the number of projects that we have underway for the next 5 years, in my opinion, completely changed the whole perception of the Guggenheim. And we're going to be doing things that will have an astonishing range, an astonishing level of quality, and I think are also going to contribute to the, to the overall success of the institution. But perhaps, and maybe just as importantly, I think they're going to suggest ways that, cultural institutions can evolve in the future, because we live at a remarkable moment in time. More people talk to one another than ever before. The internet has linked us all. Culture is becoming something that everybody shares. These are powerful, powerful narratives. Our job is basically to make these narratives accessible and to provide cultural context and cultural experience, all the while remembering that, in some ways it's all a fiction. As I said in the beginning, museums are artificial on one level, but they are also authentic, that they reflect cultural experience, I believe, in the best possible sense of the word. And what's exciting about what we do is that we can take this, this notion on and almost take it wherever we want to go. We've opened up our thinking on this project, and it's actually made the Guggenheim a kind of interesting place. It's a demanding place to be, but it's an interesting place to be because we have so much in front of us. So I'm going to stop there. As I promised Wes when I came in, I'll stay here as long as you'd like if you have some questions. You've been a very patient audience. Thank you very much for having me. It's been a delight to be here. Thanks very much.